Hi, everyone. We're so excited that you are joining us tonight. I'm Laura Thompson, Director of Education at MoCA, and I'd like to welcome you and express my gratitude for your attention to the important topics that we'll be discussing tonight, and that is part of our in-session panel discussions that we have organized in collaboration with Massachusetts College of Liberal Arts, better known as MCLA. We have been doing this panel of discussions with community members, artists, and museum professionals with a lens on anti-racist work in museums. We kicked off this program with an artist panel in December, and you can see that on our YouTube channel, building off of our work with Sean Leonardo, whose exhibition, Breath of Empty Space, was on view in MoCA and has now since moved to the Bronx Museum of Art. Today's panel is with museum leaders and is part of a two-part discussion addressing trauma and the consumption of art. We're planning 2 additional in-session programs to take place in March and April, so look forward to those announcements in the future. Before we begin, I'd like to thank my colleague, Erica Wall, who's the director of MCLA's Berkshire Cultural Resource Center and Gallery 51, who's doing amazing work with bringing more visibility to BIPOC artists. Thank you for your wisdom and for helping shape this program. Thank you to the panelists who will be speaking today from their home bases in New Haven, North Adams, Pittsburgh, Los Angeles, New Jersey, and Brooklyn. We appreciate your openness to share your thinking on the current state of affairs of museums and the arts. And while I have the floor, thank you to the museum staff and leadership for helping with and supporting this program during these very tumultuous times. I'm delighted now to turn over the mic to Erica.
I have to unmute myself would be a good thing to start with. Welcome, everyone. I am so pleased to be here once again, and a big thank you to you, Laura, and to the entire MoCA staff for its continued support and commitment to partnering with MCLA. We are honored to host yet another esteemed panel to whom we are grateful for graciously accepting our invitation. These are tumultuous times, and in this tumultuous climate in which we are living, we are all being asked to discuss and address issues and concerns, particularly around race, that we have not felt comfortable addressing in the past, and our institutions are no exception. We have asked these art leaders to discuss how and why answering these difficult questions as they pertain to their institutions is or is not taking place, or creating shifts, changes, and movements to advance these discussions towards positive change. Vulnerable space in which we placed our guests, and we respect and appreciate this, and we honor their participation and their honesty. As with our previous conversations, our panelists will discuss and explore often uncomfortable processes of interrogation and problem solving that enable all of us to move forward and do the work of dismantling systemic racism. Our distinguished panel comprises some of the most innovative and impactful leaders in the art world today. Joining us this evening is Lisa Dent, Executive Director of Artspace New Haven, Tracy Moore, Interim Director at MoCA, Cameron Shaw, Deputy Director of the California African American Museum, and Eric Shiner, Executive Director at Pioneer Works. To open and provide context for this evening's discussion, I welcome Dr. Mindy Fullilove, a social psychiatrist and professor of urban policy and health at the New School. Since 1986, she's conducted research on AIDS and other epidemics of poor communities, with a special interest in the relationship between the collapse of communities and decline in health. From her research, she has published numerous articles, book chapters, and monographs. And her latest book, Main Street: How a City's Heart Connects Us All, was released in September of 2020 by New Village Press. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Fullilove.
Thank you so much, Erica. It's a great honor to be here with all these distinguished museum leaders. As Erica said, I'm a social psychiatrist, and therefore I'm a visitor, frequent visitor to museums, but know nothing about how they actually operate. So I want to speak from the perspective of my discipline, which is how social systems make health. And I'm going to share my screen and talk about a few slides. And the point that I would like to make this evening, I can just figure out how to do this. The point that I would like to focus on this evening is that dismantling systemic racism sits within a larger problem of how is the United States going to remake the we? And in this case, we has very specific significance in social psychiatry that I would like to explain to you. When I was a resident in psychiatry, a very important paper was published by George Engels, which said that people have diseases inside their bodies, but the people are also located in social systems. So this is the core diagram where here's the person, this particular person had had a heart attack. And these are all the systems inside his body, but these are the systems of his life. And both were affected. So medicine, biomedicine, which is what most doctors practice these days, is entirely focused down. So the person, all that's interior to the person. But my work as a social psychiatrist is focused up. So how the person is sitting in the systems of the world. And so core thought in social psychiatry is that social organization is key to health, and that there's a continuum of social organization. On the one end, we have what was named integration, also called the model, which has to do with tight bonds that hold communities together. In that situation, you have a small number of strong leaders, large networks that can pass information, shared sentiments, commitment to collective good, the we, rates of illness that are comparatively low, and the management of any problem is facilitated. So this is what you want to live in. And an interesting fact is that a rich person, right, or we can say it the other way, a poor person in an integrated system will have better health than a rich person in a disintegrated system. You can follow that. But it's not your money. It's what kind of social system you live in. Disintegration, the collection, has few and weak leaders, small fractured networks, differing sentiments, high concern for the self, the I becomes what's key, higher rates of illness and social pathology, and illness is much more difficult to manage. So this is like the foundation of my discipline, this concept. I was working in Harlem in the early 90s when there were many of these epidemics of poor communities. So I was studying the AIDS epidemic, but we also had to look at the crack epidemic, the violence epidemic, the mental illness related to violence epidemic, the multi-drug resistant tuberculosis epidemic, the asthma epidemic, and then the obesity epidemic in a period of 10 years. So we said, what's going on? How are so many epidemics hurting this set of poor inner city neighborhoods? And we learned that there had been a set of policies. Now, these are policies of the government at the federal, state, and local level that had undermined the ability of the community to function. So Harlem and other communities were much closer to the model. For example, Pittsburgh. Cecile is from Pittsburgh and probably knows about the Hill District, which I've had an opportunity to spend a lot of time in. So each of these policies broke social bonds, but with each one of them, there was further collapse. So a stage state model asks what's the state of whatever you're studying at a particular stage in the process. So in Harlem in the 90s, under the weight of all these policies and all those epidemics, what we observed was what we called nonsense. You would walk down the street and see things that just didn't make any sense. But what's important is that nonsense is part of moving towards a collection. Margaret Thatcher famously said there's no such thing as society, but she said just individuals. But you can't have a collection without having nonsense. So these two things go together. What's important in the study of the geography of all these problems, any problem you want to mention, is that they move. So that a problem that's in Harlem is going to move out geographically across the nation, but it's also going to move up the social hierarchy. And so much of what we've seen in the past 2 weeks has really been an expression of nonsense across the country. In fact, the last year, the gross mismanagement of the COVID pandemic has been an exhibition of nonsense. So what we want to have are shared sentiments and a commitment to the collective good, to the we. Just as one example, Rosa Parks was arrested at 5 o'clock on December 1st, which was a Thursday. And the Montgomery bus boycott started at 6 a.m. on Monday morning, and 50,000 Black people boycotted the buses. That's a small number of strong leaders, large networks that can pass information and shared sentiments, and a commitment to the collective good. That's what it looks like. So I want to argue that we are in disintegration. Our nation at this point has fallen into this state of collection. We've been torn apart by policies. And every institution has a piece of the repair to participate in. And so to all of you who lead museums, the question is, how do you participate in remaking the we? I had the opportunity to write a book on ending police violence. I worked with Hannah L.F. Cooper, who's on faculty at Emory. Our book is called From Enforcers to Guardians, a public health primer on ending police violence. And one of the things that really struck us was that many small things had been tried to end police violence, like implicit bias training. And many of these small things, and even some of the larger things, worked, but they worked briefly, and then there was backsliding. These kinds of targeted interventions in public health are called magic bullets. Sort of like penicillin was supposed to end all syphilis, all gonorrhea. What we know is that now gonorrhea is resistant to drugs. So it didn't end it, the germs got ahead of us. So magic bullets do not work. Rather, what the ecologists have taught us is that we have to have magic strategies, have multiple parts. So at the end of our book, we propose a 6-part magic strategy to end police violence. Most importantly, we say that you have to include ending the marginality of people of color and of working people in the strategy. It's not something you hope will happen. It's got to be part of the strategy. At the same time, you've got to support the precincts, because that's at the local level where the police operate. So what I want to pose to you as museum leaders tonight is that we're really in a profound crisis. According to me as a social psychiatrist, that's my diagnosis. That we have become a collection of individuals who don't like each other very much. And we are charged with remaking the we. So there are 4 things that I think are important about museums. One is that they're bridging institutions. All kinds of people go to museums. You are connected to all kinds of other institutions in the society. So the issue is, who can you link? We make the we by connecting. We have to reconnect people. Who can you reconnect? Secondly, museums have many stories to tell. And at this moment, we need stories that help us toward solidarity. The wonderful young poet who read yesterday at the inauguration said that we aren't a nation that's broken, we're in process. Not her elegant framing. I actually believe we are broken, but we did need to hear that there was a process by which that we could go forward. I felt very good when she said it, even though I was like, yeah, that's not quite right, but thank you for saying it. Museums have been part of the big lie that there was such a thing as white supremacy, which was a lie to all white working class white people who were not going to be part of the grift, and certainly a lie to all Black people who were being told that they were inferior. What is your role in fixing that? And then I believe that museums can heal, that art is a miraculous thing, and history is a miraculous thing, and science is miraculous, and that you have learned how to bring us into art and science and history and all the other aspects of human culture in ways that let us feel really the mysteries and the glories of the universe. And these things are badly needed in these times. I wanted to end with just a simple thing that in the Washington Post today, this photograph of the Oval Office redecorated by Joseph Biden for his presidency. And it's a different place, and it's been curated to say, welcome. These are the stories that I want you to have as you come into my space. And this is what we all have to do. He is profoundly committed to remaking the we. He needs the support of all of us. So I'd like to leave you with that challenge that if we don't remake the we will kill each other. How can you take your piece? Thank you.
Let's see. Thank you, Mindy. I really appreciate that introduction, and I think that sets a wonderful opportunity for us to start this conversation. Now I'd like to introduce our moderator, Cecile Shellman, who's a full-time consultant providing diversity, equity, accessibility, inclusion, and anti-racism services for museums. Her expertise spans leadership roles and work at such institutions as Carnegie Museums of Pittsburgh, the Andy Warhol Museum, the August Wilson Center for African American Culture, the John F. Kennedy Presidential Library and Museum, and many more institutions across the country. She holds a CMS from Harvard University and a BFA in painting from Brigham Young University, and was named an American Alliance of Museums Facing Change Senior Diversity Fellow in 2019. Please join me in welcoming Cecile Shellman.
Thank you very much. It's an honor to be here this evening. Thank you, everyone, and welcome from around the country and perhaps even from around the world. It truly is an exceptional opportunity to share the stage with such luminaries from across the museum world and to grapple with these vexing questions that Dr. Fullilove has so beautifully set up as we begin this discussion. And indeed, it will be more of a dialogue. We are here to, or I am here particularly to raise the questions. This whole discussion is designed to engender questions. It's meant to be a dialogue. And together, the panelists, who I will introduce in turn, will be speaking to the questions and speaking with each other. And also we will hear from you, valued guests, as we read your questions, and you're invited to share your wisdom and knowledge on the topic as well. Allow me then to introduce each of the panelists. First, beginning with Eric Shiner. Eric Shiner is the Executive Director of Pioneer Works in Brooklyn. He was formerly the Artistic Director of White Cube, New York, and the Senior Vice President of Contemporary Art at Sotheby's and Director of the Andy Warhol Museum in Pittsburgh. So good to see you, my friend. Welcome and thank you.
So good to see you, Cecile. And hi, everyone.
And next we have Cameron Shaw. Cameron Shaw is the Deputy Director and Chief Curator at the California African American Museum in Los Angeles, California. She was previously the co-founder and Executive Director of New Orleans-based Pelican Bomb, a nonprofit contemporary art organization that presented a forum for exhibitions, public programs, and arts journalism.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Cecile.
You're welcome. Next, we have Lisa Dent. Lisa Dent is the Executive Director of Artspace New Haven. Previously, she was the Director of Resources and Awards Programs at Creative Capital and held curatorial staff positions at the New Museum of Contemporary Art, the Whitney Museum of American Art, and the Columbus Museum of Art in Ohio. Welcome. And then we have Tracy Moore, who joined MoCA in 2019 as a Deputy Director, Chief Operations and Finance Officer, and was appointed MoCA's Interim Director on October 30, 2020. Prior to MoCA, she served as the Director of Public Programs and Audience Development. audience engagement, and then co-executive director of the Aldrich Contemporary Art Museum in Richfield, Connecticut. So again, I'm surrounded by luminaries, each of whom has been wrestling with this, as we all have. And I was very moved by the questions that Dr. Fullilove posed, particularly the two regarding stories, because after all, museums are about stories, and they should be about truth-telling. We have been faced with a crisis in telling truth, speaking truth to power, and allowing our stories to teach and to heal. So the two particular questions of Dr. Fullilove's I would like to begin with and to pose to our esteemed panelists are, which stories can help us toward solidarity? And in which specific ways have your museums been part of the big lie?
Are you going to call on us or should we jump in, Cecile?
Anyone, will you please? Yes, I would very much like this to be an informal but engaging discussion. So anyone who would like to pick that baton up and answer the question, I'd very much like to hear from you.
I would just start off by saying we have to look at the very underpinnings of the museum industry and profession, rife as it is with racism and elitism and so many other negatives. And yet it was modeled on a way to somehow uplift society. So it is a paradox right out of the chutes. And I know Lisa wants to talk a little bit more about those underpinnings when she speaks, but just thinking about stories, and story is embedded in art history or in history. But art history, until very recently, was very specific and very catered to a very elite and very white audience. And only within the past 20 to 30 years have activists from all angles, whether feminist activists, queer activists, African-American activists, Latino activists, have started to chip away at those very foundations that are so incredibly problematic. And we have to think about the stories that haven't been told and how to make sure that they are told and to make sure they're told loudly. So that's where I'll start.
Yeah. You know, it's interesting that the word story came up because I often tell some of my friends and colleagues in the performing arts or in film that one of the reasons I think I gravitated towards visual arts was my inability to really express myself in a linear narrative fashion. And so that for me, the visual arts, I connected to these objects in this immediate emotional way. And you know, I made a very clear decision to learn the stories through a Black lens rather than another lens. And then came to finding jobs and felt that I was lacking in the education or the narrative that was being put up at MoMA or these other places. And had to learn them, but that was not happening from the other side in. You know, that my colleagues were not necessarily asked or interested in learning the stories I knew. I needed to spend a lot of time learning the stories they knew. And I think that, you know, what Eric was alluding to and what I learned was that museums were really set up for, here's my cat tail, set up for wealthy men to receive penance by sharing their objects with the rest of the world. And, you know, spiritually, financially, you know, they were receiving, you know, it was a way for them to be seen as or heralded in the community rather than the robber barons that I think many of them were, right? And so walking into museums became much more challenging for me as I understood that.
Yes.
Yeah, and I just wanted to underscore what Eric said about seeking the stories that we haven't told. I think we're all share a pride in our track record of diverse programming and support of BIPOC artists and creating a forum for their ideas and their voices. And what my colleagues and I are thinking a lot about right now is, is that enough? What's our institutional story around these difficult issues, and what are we bringing to bear as a museum in the dialogue? And are we really taking every opportunity to instigate storytelling and exchange and our own place in these challenges? So that's on our mind right now.
Yeah, it's a challenging question for me to answer, because I think I'm coming from a very different perspective and a very different lived experience in my own professional life. How I came up to be in a leadership role in a museum was really from being outside of museums for the majority of my career. So I think that really influences how I respond even to this question, or sort of the absence of response that I actually have to this question, quite frankly. But then on another hand, I work within a culturally specific institution. So CAM was founded in 1977 by a group of visionary activists, politicians, community folk who knew that there needed to be a state-supported institution to tell the stories of Black people. And a state-supported institution that would be an art and history museum. So CAM is the first such thing. And so, when I think about my role in the museum, I really think about that legacy, and I think about the ways in which we can be as visionary in telling our stories and thinking about our institution as our founders were in 1977. And when I think about this question of, museums centering the stories of people of color, I mean, that has always been at the center of what CAM has done. So, our mandate is to create an accessible, inclusive, and dynamic space where all people can see the lives, stories, and experiences of Black people valued and reflected. So that's at the core of what we do. So now I think I'm now in this space of where do we move next? What can I do within my institution that actually takes us to the next place? So I'm thinking a lot about depth rather than breadth. I'm moving away from centering or ideas of centering and thinking about what does it mean to be a midwife, right? What does it mean to support revolutionary ideas entering into the world? How do we do that from a financial support? How do we do that from administrative support? How do we do that from a spiritual support? So that's really where I am. So I apologize that I was sort of struggling for a moment to even think of how did I enter into the question.
All good thoughts, and it really strikes me that the stories we tell are not only about the stories of the objects we hold and have in our care, but as Cameron is explaining too, the stories of our own or institutional life and mission, our own staffs and boards and executive leaders, what's happening inside our museum spaces as well. And then if you speak to that about not just interpreting objects and speaking of objects and looking through a lens that is diversity, equity, and inclusion focused, but also what are you doing inside your museums to be anti-racist and anti-oppressive?
Well, I'll say I think that's a great question, first of all, and really one of the many challenges we face. Again, the work is so obviously object and art and artist focused forward, but how are we examining governance? How are we examining our fundraising sources? Those kind of questions to really go deep, all areas of the operation of our museum and what makes it work and what we need in place and the structures and really instigating a conversation around hard examination of those practices and those sort of museum traditions that we all know. They all function in a certain way and they're supported in a certain way. So again, is our programmatic track record only being part of the story.
Yeah.
And I think it's so critically important that all museums create safe spaces where these sorts of dialogues and conversations can happen, because sadly, very few museums are even open to having the conversations on equity and inclusion, diversity and accessibility topics that are so important, always have been. And just creating that safe space and letting team members who want to participate, and some people won't participate and won't feel comfortable participating, and that's okay too. At Pioneer Works, we're so lucky to have such a wonderful team, and Christina Daniels and our team is leading the charge with our DEI initiatives, which we started as soon as I became executive director earlier this year. We're able to work with Cecile early on, which was a really wonderful foundation. And now we're making sure that everything that we learned is baked into the strategic plan and the vision of the institution, so that it is always there going forward, and it is always thought about on every front, as you were saying, Tracy, so that it is really made sure that it is part of the fabric of the institution, that equity matters on all fronts.
Yeah, so our staff is predominantly people of color, majority Black. So when I'm in these issues, I'm thinking a lot about institutional culture. I'm thinking a lot about what does it mean to make collaborative work environments. You know, my background, Pelican Bomb, which was in New Orleans and has since sunsetted, I ran that with another group of individuals. So we were practicing active co-decision making, consensus building, co-curation. It was, I was the executive director in name, but in many ways we were a non-hierarchical organization, and we were very much a leaderful organization. So different people stepped up based on their moment of knowledge, expertise, skill, and often passion. And we really practice active deference. So when do you listen because you see someone else is coming with the skills, experience, and passion? And when do you say, you know what, you care about this so deeply, I want to see you take the lead on this, and I'll step back. And we were constantly doing that dance of stepping forward and stepping back, you know, very much involved in sort of the, what is now known as emergent strategy, institution making and organization building. So, you know, I really come from that place of value-based institution building and working from theory to practice. So how are the ideas about the world we want to live in, how are they enacted in our day-to-day life and in our relationships with one another? So right now I'm really thinking about, you know, I work within a state institution. So in many ways I work within a structure that has a very firm hierarchy and many rules that govern how that hierarchy works. So how am I able to bring some of the working methods from a previous existence and really think about how these two things can kind of coexist at once? And it's a great challenge, but it's something that excites me really deeply.
Wonderful, thank you. Yes, now I'm getting some questions from the floor actually. They're coming hard and fast. And one of them is rather provocative, and I'm going to read it as it's quoted here. I do not want to seem disrespectful, but doesn't this seem a bit fake? Why can we not just tell the truth? Trying to include everyone is fake, is it not?
I have to say that was really interesting because I was walking my dog and talking on the phone with my mother, and you know, I'm the kind of person I'm very comfortable if someone's really interested in football and I'm going to be interested in museums. And if you don't want to go to a museum, I think maybe you should in your lifetime, but maybe you're not an active museum goer. So sometimes the conversations about creating an anti-racist environment around and like audience, for me, doesn't really get to what I think should be anti-racist work within museums, because I think it's closer to what Tracy is invoking around structure. And what I would like to see is all kinds of people working at a museum. And it's not just that they're working at the museum, but that they are financially supported, and that they have the same resources as leadership, and that they will not be let go for speaking out, right? So one of the biggest challenges I think that I've seen over the years that I've been working is that you might see a few people of color working someplace for a while, and then that person has gone, or that person has decided that they need to leave the field. And why is that? And, you know, when you realize how many other people have been able to have full careers with retirement and have families and be supported, can remain in the field, and there are few and far between BIPOC people who can say that. They might have done it for a time and they had to leave. And I think this is what I wanted to just mention, that what Cameron said was really interesting to me in relation to what Dr. Fullilove said, because when you talk, I think one of the challenges for me the last few years is, in being anti-racist, does that mean everyone gets to lead? And the idea that, no, you still maybe need a few leaders that are really strong and helpful, and that, but they are willing to, you know, take care of their team and really take care of their team. Because not everyone wants to be a leader. Not everyone wants to, they have other responsibilities. They have other abilities that they, you know, make it more difficult for them to not do it. But what I more often see are real pushes to be in charge, and then simply reenact the oppression that was the way that they see leadership being acted out. And, you know, I try to remain optimistic, but I see this over and over again.
So true. Very true, Lisa. I mean, we unwittingly revisit those harms if we don't, you know, do a deep excavation of everything that is amiss. And that takes time. And so when I hear this question about, you know, tell the truth, is this actually happening? Does this work? I think we have to remember, you know, it takes time. It took a lot of time for things to get the way that they are, calcified, ossified, inculcated.
Yeah.
And so it will take a lot of time to undo. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't stop telling the truth and shouldn't continue the work.
Well, I think there's also a real tension that even I felt coming into this conversation, which is acknowledging how important these conversations are across the field, acknowledging how important they are to be having in public, and also really feeling deeply that right now I'm going in and not out, right? These are the conversations that are happening within our institution, with our board, with our staff, with the artists and scholars and thinkers that we're working with. So I'm thinking less about the field right now in the sense of, what are you doing? What should I be doing? What should the field be doing? What should museums be doing? It doesn't interest me what museums should be doing. I don't think there's actually an answer what museums should be doing. I think we should all be thinking, or I am thinking, I had to catch myself even in that language, right? Because this language is so embedded in, you know, in all of this that we're working on with our own decolonization. But for me, I'm thinking about the ways I can show up for the people around me how I can build strong bonds within my organization for people to show up and feel like they are valued and respected, that they are seen and that they are held, that they have a great deal of generosity and they get to pursue the things that are deeply important to them. And I try to think about what that framework looks like for CAM. I can't say what that framework looks like for any other institution because I don't go and engage with that institution every day. All I can be with is the people that I'm with. Right now, for me, that's where my energy is on that sort of interpersonal healing and thinking about the ways in which that interpersonal healing scales up, right? So if we can create this sense amongst ourselves in our one-on-one conversations, in our team meetings, in our conversations with artists, with curators, with scholars, with funders, with the janitor, with the registrar, with, you know, that if we can start to get this for ourselves, it's going to reverberate. It's going to scale out, that each little beacon of light then becomes the beacon that lights another. And soon all of us are covered in light. That's where my thinking is right now. And, you know, it's as much a spiritual framework, I think, for thinking about my work as it is an intellectual or political framework for thinking about my work.
I think that's so interesting because I do think we in the field, you know, it's a generalization, but we tend to get attached to sorting out best practices for the field and where we situate within that, and, you know, creating models for the field. And you're right, Cameron, I mean, the work is so personal, so personally personal and so institutionally personal, that's where the focus just needs to start and lie. I don't know how that step could be skipped, and I'm really moved by what you're saying. I'll also, just back to sort of Lisa's point about leadership, you know, I've been thinking a lot about it in the role that I'm playing. And when I'm not playing it, I'll still be in a leadership role, but just starting to assert and insist that we break down there's no hierarchy in ideas. You know, not everyone's going to be the museum director, but we have to make way for energy and ideas coming from all corners of our institution, our community, our artist community, because none of us have a monopoly on what the right decisions are right now. So it has to be a collection of voices that is outside of the org chart.
Great. Eric, have you anything to add to this?
I agree fully, and make space and make room for people to talk and share ideas and think outside of the box. That is a very trite thing that we've been saying for a long time, but it's always been very shocking to me how few people think outside of the box within the museum industry, which should be constantly thinking outside of the box and constantly creative, but in many cases isn't. So I've always been encouraging everyone on the team to rip the box apart and reinvent the box, then start sharing.
Yes, you're very good at that. Here's another question from the field. And the question reads, so it sounds like before addressing structural issues, there needs to be a change in mindset. As museum leaders, how do you encourage and inspire staff, trustees, donors, and other stakeholders to get on board?
I invite them to. I mean, I think a lot of people forget to just invite people to do that, you know, and to do it in a way that is without bitterness or judgment, and to meet people where they are, and to understand that you can respect each other and disagree. And, you know, these are the things that I'm constantly surprised are not happening behind the doors of these institutions. So I would just say that as a beginning.
I agree. And also just dispel the notion that we expect these conversations to end in solutions or answers or roadmaps or the next exact step, that it just starts with the invitation to talk and the acceptance that people are going to be exhausted and devastated by what's going on also, and making space for that.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much for saying that, Tracy. I think that's been really one of the challenges for me during this time and being in a leadership role of this time is how do I show up as an authentic person who's also going through this, right? Like, how do I hold the tension of, I do want my organization and everyone in it to thrive at this time. I want us to pivot to be COVID ready. I want us to continue to engage with our publics. I want all those things, right? And I also just like, want to acknowledge that we're in a culture that's forcing us to work through global pandemic, through righteous uprising and violent insurrection, like that we are asked to show up every day. And this is the culture of capitalism. And this is what it's asking from us. So like, how do I hold all of those tensions, all of those wants, those needs, those fears and desires at the same time and show up with them? So I just appreciate, Tracy, you just really also placing the fact that we are doing this work against a backdrop of unimaginable suffering and loss and grief.
Yeah. And I don't do it well every day for myself or my colleagues, so I'll cop to that now too. But it's we've got to remember that.
Absolutely, and it's made all the more horrific in that, you know, for many of us, we are disconnected just at the time we need connection the most.
No, I mean, I'm working in a smaller institution right now, but I've been very surprised and frankly disappointed about how many people have said they were disappointed in the number of programs that I ran last year. And from my perspective, our staff needed the same support as anyone else around the country. And I also felt that to, you know, push to people that not only should they come to our our space, but they should donate and they should do all of these things, felt very, it actually felt like best practices for the field. And it's a field that I already have challenges with, right? So, so I almost find myself, when I hear, this is curatorial practice, or this is, the way that as a field we should move forward, I'm saying, well, that's not a really good place to start because the field has never really done that. And I try to remind people that, for legal reasons, there have been all kinds of language that HR departments are aware of around DEI and all that stuff for, 30 or 40 years in the museum field. It's just never been enforced. And instead, there's a lot of protection that has gone towards white staff members who were acting out without any repercussions, and BIPOC and other people of color are let go, right? That's the museum, working in a museum world that I understand. And the only counter to that is that I see with other colleagues is their ability to compartmentalize. So they can, this is important for me to be A or B staff person in the museum because we need to be there, and I'm not gonna be, concerned about what was in the past or what's around me. And I think compartmentalizing can also be to your detriment and not allow you to really make change where you are.
Indeed. Yeah. Now, here are some other questions regarding creating buy-in and, and also thinking about leadership roles versus leadership. In fact, I've had some conversations recently about that myself. And the question is, given all the dynamics that you're discussing, what is the leadership that is required in this moment? Or what are the needed interventions that you are willing to risk? No risk, no reward, right?
Well, one of the things I mentioned in a talk a few years ago was to help people understand that museum directors are not required to take care of their staff. That's not really what the board is talking to them about. What they're talking to them about is making sure that there's financial stability, that there are important acquisitions being added to their collections. And so, leadership, good leadership has sort of focused on that. And because museums are nonprofit public spaces, it's about, what are we giving to the visitor and what are we, stories are we bringing? And so really great curators are leaders and they are bringing this to the forefront, but there's a lot of other ways when you're working at them. Curators aren't really your leaders. They are tasked with doing work that is at the forefront and sort of easily seen. But outside of their smaller departments, they're not leading larger portions of the museum and larger administrative functions. And so sometimes seeing a lot of attention around curators and that part of the museum doesn't really go towards what leadership at that institution is actually about.
Yeah.
And so I think that's very opaque. And I don't believe anybody's really talking about leadership outside of amassing wealth and objects, right?
Yeah. And that's the status quo that you have to tear down, because it's about building that community, the internal community, the family of the museum in a good way, that people feel safe, trusted, listened to, and that of course that you can talk about the economics, but without that core base of a team working together to make magic happen, why even bother? I'm always very idealistic, but have always prioritized the community over all else, because that's where the magic happens.
Yeah.
Servant leadership, it's a term that is finally, coming into vogue around what museums need to do to change.
And Lisa, I also think something that you said was so important about the ways in which not only does it focus on the curator obscure many of the conditions of the making, right? It invisibilizes a lot of the labor. And that it reinforces, I think, a lot of the inequalities that we see within our museum structures. So, it's the work that I think we're all doing or moving toward is, how do we begin to dismantle these structures while also valuing, I think, Cecile, it might have even been you that started with, just acknowledging the great work that museums do and the public service that, again, I feel like I'm really in this space and like, I even feel myself like the scales of justice of like, I really do feel we're in this moment where we're holding so many truths at once. And it can be dizzying and disorienting and heady and exciting. And it can be exhausting, and it can just be frankly exhausting.
Yeah.
I agree. And it just, I'll add, and it's, maybe not squarely about leadership, although it's on my mind, and it's just sort of being less precious with the expertise around the art. Like it's always held in a certain department or in certain circles, and you have to have a certain vocabulary to be able to engage the public around it. And I just think that's also part of breaking down these typical structures. I mean, there are people across Mass MoCA's campus. We have 131 people that work here, and less than 25% of them are content developers, and the rest are why it can even be here and why the public can experience it. And so sort of sharing the knowledge, breaking down the hierarchy of who's an expert and who's allowed to have an opinion and engage, both externally with audiences, but internally as well.
But I think there's a real complication there, which I think gets to something that Mindy was introducing, is we are also doing this work at a time where we're seeing, especially in our country, a devaluing, just a complete disregard for the fact that expertise, knowledge, or fact matters, right?
True.
So like, how, you know, that's
Sure.
that's another challenge that I feel when we're doing this work of like, how do we also acknowledge that, you know, there is expertise, there is skill, there is knowledge. These are things that we want to continue to value and build a like equitable and value-focused work environment.
Sure.
It seems like a good time then to introduce this question. And it is around expertise. So back to telling stories and the artist. The question is, should the artist and subject's backgrounds and identities be considered first before artistic merits? So to me, the way I interpret that is, you know, what should take prominence? Should it be the fact that you're looking at artists in terms of their race and ethnicity, and ensuring that they do have space and a place in your museums in order to undo some of these, you know, these oppressive norms? Or, you know, is it more important to defer to this, you know, white dominant idea of excellence?
I mean, I think,
Go ahead, Lisa.
oh, sorry. Well, I just think, you know, even though I was talking about my sort of love of visual art because I can't necessarily tell a straight narrative, or it's helping me communicate. I do think it's important as you learn about an object or a painting or whatever, that you're understanding the economies that allowed that to be created. So I thought it was really interesting what Dr. Fullilove is talking about. They might be, you know, might feel it's your identity or emotions, but really the state is kind of moving in and out of that, right? And your ability to even get to the point where you're able to create an artwork. So it's hard for me to say that it's important first, but one of the reasons I love art is that I come back to these objects and I learn about them in a different way, or I read something else and then I see it again. And, but learning someone's identity is part of that, as well as like the materials that they were able to use, the scale that they were able to make the object in. You know, these, as far as I'm concerned, relate to a person's access to resources and identity, right? So I do think you need to consider it, or it's part of your learning about the work.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I agree fully. You have to look at 360 degrees, and the artist and the object are one and connected always. They may be separated by distance and time, and yet that act of making is so intimate that they are forever tied together. So looking at the stories behind the artist and the object, and looking for those stories that will be inspiring to others, looking for that spark is always so important. And sometimes the spark may be more heavily laid on the biography and other times on the object, and oftentimes paired together in perfect unity.
I want you all to be able to speak, but I just want to say something about that, because I'm always fascinated that with music, dance, even, you know, film, there can be like all kinds of ways to look at those things. But I don't know why with visual art, you know, is it because it became academic and there was sort of a Socratic way that we learned about these things? I don't know. It just feels like people want to know exactly how to do it right, where you can, I don't find it to be the case in other media, which I always find fascinating.
You're right, because other media are so much more open to interpretation and to different methodologies, whereas art, well, maybe it has something to do with like paint by numbers, where it was so embedded in the psyche that this is the way you do it.
Yeah.
But
Or
great art is about
scholarships.
breaking rules.
Right. Is it around skill, or is it the scholarship piece? I've been fascinated, but people will listen to like the same terrible pop songs over and over again. And they're like not very complicated, but they won't give art that same, I don't know, time somehow.
Yeah.
Here's a follow-up question that kind of extends this notion. And it reads, if the history, HIS in capitals, the history books about art and artists have been written and taught by white people, how do we rewrite and re-educate teachers and influencers, including museums, about the work of non-white artists now?
It's a lot of work.
Yeah.
A lot of work needs to be done.
Mhm.
And do we learn about those things in the kind of writing that has been used in the field previously? Is that the way to keep moving forward?
Right, right.
The
Yeah.
writing piece really comes up for me. So I have spent a lot of my time as a freelance writer and editor and working with arts writers in specific, and being an arts writer myself. So something I've thought a lot about is the way that we use language to introduce the experience of art or the experience of objects, and what are the frames of references that we use, right? And how can critics and writers and museums, folks writing labels, et cetera, really expand the set of reference points, right? I always think about this piece that I wrote early on in my writing career, and I really credit an editor for just like letting me go down this pathway that was very authentic to me, which is when I saw the work of Nicolene Thomas for the first time, all I could think about, in addition to Warhol and all the other things that were on display from an art historical background, was going to Loehmann's as a kid with my mom to buy my like prom dress. And that room where there's just all these women, I don't know if there's a Loehmann's in all of your cities, but it's like a discount store where there would be this.
Oh yeah.
And it was surrounded by mirrors and women of all shapes, sizes, colors, ages, and they'd all be in their little groups or on their own and just preening and looking at themselves and taking it in. And for me, that's what I saw when I saw Nicolene's work. And so I said, you know what, I actually think this is important as a writer to say, this is what I see. And if you see an afternoon with your grandfather, or you see a baseball game, that's as, valid as seeing or reading into something Foucault, right? And that like we have to really expand and offer more entry points for people to have art experiences and understand that whatever they're seeing or whatever those moments are that are coming up for them are equally as valid entry points for understanding or engaging with an object or an art experience.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Hallelujah.
I actually think there's an argument for drawing something that you're looking at before you write about it. There's something really fascinating that happens when you understand what's in front of you the way through drawing versus writing. I think, and I think not enough art historians and writers at one point were encouraged to take art classes, and I thought it was a mistake, because you really begin to understand the power of what visual artists can do, and that they see things that not everybody sees. And writers can sort of use that to be inspired to write about something or do that. But what is the feeling, the love, the joy, or whatever it is, or you're investigating something differently, I think, when you're drawing it.
I love that. And one of the things for me when I was writing was I would sort of find myself spontaneously writing these little kind of poems, these sort of word salads that were inspired by what I was seeing. And, some of them would make it into, coherent pieces that you would find in an art magazine or a newspaper. And then some of them would stay these little private poems for for me, and eventually I got to this point where I had a desire to share the poetry, but I learned a lot through the poetry about how the thing made me feel or think, or what it evoked. And I never thought about drawing, and I love that. I just love it. It's so beautiful.
Yeah, so there are some other questions, concerning, I think, just continuing this conversation, and one that I'm really interested in hearing your responses to regards art as a luxury. So it's talking about access and equity. And I think I'll just go ahead and read it. How Audre Lorde wrote that poetry is not a luxury, but the access to art, including museums, seems to be for an elite, white, and educated audience who can afford the admission fees and travel to quaint towns where museums exist. How do you engage different socioeconomic groups and races in being interested and more engaged in the visual arts?
You start to tear down those barriers. At Pioneer Works, we're very proud that 70 to 80% of our programs are free and open to the public, and that's on purpose to make our site as accessible and welcoming as humanly possible for all, to tear down those economic barriers to entry that are very real, and also just to make sure that you're welcoming once people arrive, which a lot of places sadly aren't. And that means a lot. It's like, how do you make sure every single person has a wonderful experience when they walk through your doors? And the reality of the art market is it is an incredibly elitist place. And yet there are wonderful artists who are making sure that art is accessible to all, like Willie Cole with his wonderful t-shirts and sweatshirts, Black Art Matters, which has been such a wonderful campaign to make sure that people have easy, affordable access to art and to messaging. And I hope we see more of that.
I think too, programs like this and really thinking thoughtfully about partnerships and programmatic outreach, sort of keeping ourselves in check. Are we creating enough opportunity for conversation? Are we asking enough questions? Are we presenting art, leaving it open for interpretation by not telling everyone what they want to see, but also not inviting questioning in some active way? So just thinking about that exchange and always reminding ourselves and checking ourselves if we're creating at every possible opportunity an exchange versus a presentation or a download of information.
Yes. Great.
Yeah, it's interesting that the way that the question was constructed, each thing that you mentioned, I was like, that's because of racism, and that's because of racism, that's because of racism. Like literally these buildings constructed and the structures and the way funding moves in and out of them, are through racism. So for me, it's not necessarily about liking the building or being more comfortable with white walls. Lately, I've been really advocating for not just visual literacy education, but economic education, understanding how these places get built, because perhaps we do see racism and we want to change things, particularly to eliminate oppression in any way. But I also think you can, by demystifying how these things are constructed, people can feel more empowered to engage in that. And I would like to see, before you're bringing your school class to the work, you're not necessarily just showing them pictures of the paintings, you're talking about how that institution was created and giving them an understanding of how it's done. Now, does that mean then other BIPOC young people will then think building an institution is what they should do. Maybe, but maybe not. At least if they understand how it's been done, they can respond to it. I feel like so much of the tension right now is that they're told that this is important, and that they're told that they need to go, and they're told that they need to look at these things, but they are not also encouraged to understand financial literacy, visual literacy, understanding all of these things that help you get a better view of where you're going. And I think we do it in other ways. In fact, going back to Lohman's, like you kind of know what you're finding at Lohman's versus what you might be finding at Saks Fifth Avenue or something. You kind of understand the price point or the thing, but for whatever reason, we don't do that with museums. It's so opaque and it's so just held by the elite. And until that knowledge is disseminated, then it continue to be tension as far as I'm concerned.
I'm interested also, well, there's two things that come up for me. I'm interested in actually the ways in which the digital presence of museums proliferating during this COVID-19 time, and obviously very well aware of the digital divide and the ways in which we have inequitable access to all digital media and content, but also thinking about the ways in which like our audiences have expanded, that there are opportunities for low stakes engagement, that there are opportunities for free engagement, that there are opportunities for recordings of programs that happen on your own time, or checking in on things that maybe fit into your life better, on top of just sort of the access issue of, whether you are mobile and able to come to a museum. I think there are a lot of things that we can learn from this moment about how we can continue to engage moving forward. Also recognizing that there's a lot of labor that goes into this too, and we have to really figure out how to balance when our museums open. My museum has been closed since March. So I'm in LA, we've been closed since March. So when our museum opens, we're not going to be able to have the same ability to put energy towards digital programming because our program manager will have to go back to in-person programs, right? So, acknowledging that, but also thinking about, for me, I've been really curious about CAM's role in engaging artists to make public art. What does it mean for us to be doing things outdoors? Yeah. And what does it mean for us to be doing things across geography in such a rhizomatic place as Los Angeles? Mm-hmm. And what does it mean for us to really be engaged in a dialogue about what is a Black public art, right? Can we talk about that? Can we think about that? What can that accomplish? What can we move through by thinking about that? So those are the two things that sort of come up for me when we were sort of dancing around and dancing with that question.
Yep. And so critically important to always remember that you don't always have to depend and rely on people coming to you. You have to go out to people and spread the message in ways that traditionally haven't been done, and make sure to meet people in your immediate vicinity and community and ask people what people would like to see and go beyond the walls of the institution. It's critically important.
Indeed, indeed. And I think related to that, I like Cameron's coming back to this present moment. And there are a couple of questions about, the practical constraints of making these changes currently. How real are the constraints for changing institutional culture? How real can radical redistribution of time and salaries be when museums are currently so financially strapped? What's actually happening on the ground? How would you answer those questions?
I mean, I think they happen in other sectors, just museums have kind of rejected them for, a variety of reasons. And I remember not at a museum, but at Creative Capital when we went through an anti-racism process that then opened the budget and everyone's salaries to the whole office, and sort of have, I thought that was going to be really tough, to be honest with you. Everybody's a lot of people were basically like, yeah, that looks right. That wasn't actually the problem. in some ways. Although I will say, myself and another Black person, we're making less than our white colleagues and doing more work. And, you know, but I think that, and I'm just always for anything that makes the institution less opaque. So
Yeah.
by sharing that information, I also saw people come up with really brilliant ideas, right? Like, oh, but what if we did this and we could do that? And especially around, you know, staff benefits, there were all kinds of things that people wanted that we're going to make a lot of, we're going to make a big difference in their ability, in their work life, right? But what I will say, in the larger institutions, I think it's harder to get consensus, right? Because there's so many people. But ultimately, right now, the white people have to decide that they're going to do it because they're overwhelmingly in leadership in our museums across the country. So it's not really about writing a new document or kind of surveying or finding. People, there are a lot, and from not just in leadership, I would say actually all through the institution, who need to be willing to understand that racism exists and that it's impacting the institution and that they don't want it to continue. And how do you do that?
Oh, indeed.
I'm also really interested in how the rise of organized labor in the museum field can shape these conversations moving forward. So I work in a state institution. We are all state employees. So the majority of my employees are covered under collective bargaining. Our salaries are clear and transparent. They're set by the state. We're considered no different from employees at the DMV or another state institution. So, but as we see this, and so I've learned a lot being in that environment. I had never been in an environment where there was organized labor and collective bargaining, but seeing this happening across the country now with workers demanding for the opportunity to unionize, I think we're really going to start to see some shifts in the way we conceive of labor. I also think COVID-19 has really dramatically shifted the conversation around labor in our field and beyond. You know, we have a term now, essential worker, which was not a term that people were using a year ago in the same way. So I think it is really going to change these conversations as we move forward. And I really hope, you know, with a mind towards equity.
Well, I agree, and I'll just add that I think you know, the sort of tradition of the big secret budget and you know, that's hatched behind the director's door, and you see your piece of it maybe, and you don't know what you're accountable for or what you're contributing to. You know, we're taking small steps here, but we're taking steps to just cease that practice. And, you know, we're all working for this place. It isn't a secret. And ideas, to Lisa's point, of, you know, where resources could be distributed in a more equitable or creative or different way could come from any part of the organization. So transparency about what are these dollars, where are they coming from, how the decisions were made to put them in certain buckets, I think is really important work.
Critically important, and you know, we're taking those steps as well. And also just a reminder to everyone, start as soon as you can, and sometimes it might take a little bit of time to get to the point that you can, but post salary ranges so that everyone knows from the get-go what they're getting into, what the salary is going to be, so that you don't waste time when you then find out it's $21,000 a year, which is a reality at a lot of places, and pay your workers as much as you possibly can. That's so critically important.
That's a great segue, Eric, to another question from the floor. How are you supporting a new generation of museum workers, including entry-level positions, internships, and mentorship from the ground up, reaching beyond the privileged white connoisseur who has typically benefited from unpaid internships?
Yeah, so many ways, and making sure that, at least for us, one example of many is don't go to the traditional places to look for talent. There's a wonderful new job search website, for example, called Girl Gaze, which focuses on women, women of color, and also gender non-binary individuals. And they're the coolest organization ever. Check them out. And specifically for jobs in the creative spheres. So post jobs there, post jobs at local colleges, community colleges. Don't always just rely on NIFA, which is also great, and post there too, but not just there. Like, think outside of the box and reach out to communities that you want to be part of the conversation.
Also, a shout out to Museum Hue. That's
Yeah,
a good source.
exactly.
Yeah, I think ditto, and also to think about the ways that you're engaging once they're on your team. So are they at staff meetings along with all of your other staff? Are they in director meetings with lots of other people? Back to what Tracy said, why do these decisions have to be made behind closed doors? I think can lend itself to help someone know what to do. But I also want to mention that I don't think entry to the field is actually the primary problem in the museum or field. I actually think that it's moving to kind of, I guess I would call middle management or leadership. So, and that's kind of what I alluded to earlier, sort of losing my colleagues year after year because of working in toxic environments and not making enough money. And I think that the unions and, the Smithsonian Institution was one of the first, like what Cameron was describing, that I was seeing, okay, I know what the salary is going to be. We're kind of thinking this through, new plan, but, as a young person, you assume you're going to be able to move up and do more, but then someone sort of sweeps in who is in another field or, there's someone, and suddenly that's the way that the museum field wants to go to fill these positions instead of the BIPOC people who have been studying and doing the work for a long time. I mean, there's not a phrase, but like a saying, I think what Black people know is like, we would say white people tend to move the finish line. You're kind of always just moving it a little bit further, so, initially you want people to have this set of skills. And then at a certain point, it was like, oh, we want people in social justice and have community, experience. And then now, oh, we want, BIPOC people have this. And all it's doing is keeping a lot of Black and brown colleagues from being able to move up to leadership, right? And again, I think that's because so much of the thinking around stable institutions, particularly stable museum, is coming from white supremacists like racial capitalism, instead of thinking about it in a different way.
Oh, this has been such a fascinating conversation. I can hardly believe that we are 2 minutes from close. And so what I will do now is end with a question that is really important. And it's, how do institutions genuinely convey and show accountability to BIPOC artists, staff, and audiences?
do the work and show the proof.
But how? And I think that is something that we will be grappling with.
Yes,
continuous.
that is the journey that not only we as institutions are on, but we as a country are on, and hopefully we're starting to be back on the right track.
Hopefully so.
I think, you know, I think Cameron was right earlier saying COVID sort of allowed museums to really see what could happen in the digital realm, and even making sure land acknowledgement is on your website. Can you give more information about your team? Like all of these ways that you can sort of give people something to come back to after they visited the museum and maybe they want to learn more. And providing resources that maybe you can explain your budget, right? I've seen that in a few theater troupes, which I thought was really interesting, of just laying out the budget for their program for it. You know, how can we, you know, put that on our websites in a way that's not a 990 that sort of requires you to sort of understand a different line of thinking. Instead, it's more of a walkthrough of our budget, you know, which can be done pretty simply with a video. I'm probably like sharing too much because we're trying to do that, right? Like why can't I just sit and explain our budget? And talk to people in a certain way so that it's not so opaque.
I agree with that. And I'd say, you know, there's a mandate for museums to reimagine and investigate what their role is and what their place is in the community, listen to what community needs are and be able to respond. And we may not know how to respond, but commit to understanding it, being willing to make mistakes and transparent about screwing it up and not getting it wrong and revealing the journey along the way. Its fits, its starts, its successes, and its failures. I mean, you know, we're at the beginning here at Mass MoCA of understanding what that path is, beyond our programmatic track record and our commitment to community partnerships and a welcoming environment. And we know we don't have it all right. So just starting by saying that and turning into ourselves and defining what those steps are. And they may not be exactly correct at every turn, but being transparent about it.
Thank you.
Honest and accountable.
Yes, that humility as well. And Cameron?
I would just say the one thing that's coming up for me is being genuinely open to change in all its messiness and complication.
Indeed.
The world is changing very rapidly, and we as individuals, institutions, and a society have to change along with it and shape that change to be the change that we want to see, the world we want to live in.
Fantastic. Well, it's certainly been an enjoyable, thought-provoking, meaningful conversation. And it has been wonderful to be on this journey with you. And again, you know, we are all committed to this work, and it's wonderful to see that so many of our listeners today and those participating have those equal commitments as well. And it's every step and every part of the journey will lead to success. So thank you so much, everyone. And I turn the time over back to Laura or Erica.
Thank you, Cecile.
Thank you all for participating. That was really enlightening and really makes us aware that we are on a journey. There's not an end post to this work. It's part of the whole process of doing this work. I've been in the field for a long time, and it's just constant, like, that is the work. It's like trying to make this happen. So thank you everyone for participating, and look forward to our next panel discussion sometime in March, and we'll come coming soon to your announcement. Thank you, everyone. Good night.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you very much. Thank you. Thank you,
Bye,
everyone.
everyone.
Good
Bye.
night.
Thank you.